Welcome to Reading with Ryan. On today's episode, our 10th in our ongoing Ramadan reflection series, we're going to look at a book that has never failed to amaze me from when I first picked it up, and that is Traveling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe by Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, also known as Dr. Timothy Winter of Cambridge University and Cambridge Muslim College in the United Kingdom. This book was published in 2020 by Quilliam Press, named in honor of the famous Abdullah Quilliam, one of the first prominent British converts to Islam in the Victorian period, in the late 19th century. And this book is a compilation of essays and talks that were given either in publications and then collected into this one, or given at various events and annotated by Shaykh Abdul Hakim into the present work. And it is relevant not only to those Muslims living in Europe or those studying Islam in Europe academically, but also to those Muslims throughout the Western world, be they in America, meaning the United States of America, or the rest of North America, so Canada or Mexico, or in any parts of the former British Empire, the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Indeed, even in parts of Western Europe, France, and Germany that have large Muslim populations as well. This book is remarkable because the essays all flow together seamlessly into a unified whole, despite the fact that they were all given on separate occasions before very different audiences. For the sake of time, I'm only going to look at two of them in this presentation today, but it is worth noting that Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad is someone who, more than anything, if you ever get to meet him in person, or at least you have the opportunity to look forward to his yearly Ramadan reflections, or the various khutbahs, the sermons that he gives at the Cambridge Muslim College's mosque and academic offices, you'll find that he is immediately a self-deprecating man who repeatedly refers to, as it were, the silliness of putting oneself forward and speaking. And on the other hand, immediately one will notice a quiet, prayerful presence, born, no doubt, of many decades of daily prayer and invocation of the names of God. So for those of you watching this who are Muslim, I imagine that you're already familiar with him. Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad is one of the most widely known Muslims in the English-speaking Muslim world. He is known in interfaith circles as well as intrafaith circles. He is, of course, a Sunni and a Sufi. He is an initiate of the Qadri order, as well as, I'm told, several others potentially, but of course this is mere speculation. He is someone who exudes the best attributes of the Sunnah. And I say that, regardless of your perspective within the thought world of Islam, whether you're Sunni or Shia. Of course, he is a Sunni. But he has an adab and an akhlaq. He has an etiquette, a mannerism of tremendous respect, dignity, politeness, and courtesy, which effuses truly through the screen. So we're fortunate to have him, those of us who are either Muslims or engaged in working on Islam academically in some way, because he represents, I believe, the most globally prominent neo-traditional school of Sunni Islam today, which is ecumenical in that it is not adhering to only one of the four surviving classical Sunni legal schools, but respecting all of them. It is not particularly polemical against Shiism, the minority, whereas the Sunni view, of course, is the majority, and it is also not Salafi or Wahhabi. In other words, they stand, the Islamic neo-traditionalists, for an integrated, classicizing approach where the best aspects of the Sunni majority classical tradition within Islam are brought forward to help us better engage with the various challenges of modernity, be they the questions of Muslim assimilation in various Western countries in Europe or the Americas, or be they the questions, the existential questions that one finds oneself confronting today just by being a citizen of this world or an inhabitant on this earth. Questions of human dignity, the relationship between human beings and God, the relationship between man and the planet, and of course the relationships between not only religions and states, but also neighbors and communities. So the Islamic neo-traditionalist movement is fundamentally anti-fundamentalist in the sense that it is an intellectual movement that seeks to bring the best of traditional majoritarian Islamic scholarship, in other words, Sunni scholarship, to the forefront of Islamic public discourse, as well as public discourse by non-Muslims about Islam. So fundamentally, Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad has spent the better part of the last 30 years as a public figure in the Islamic world and as an ambassador for mainstream intellectual traditional Sunni Islam. So at once this is anti-modern in the sense that it is opposed to the sort of squishy secularism that has become all the norm in the West, in which the vast majority of European and American people, as the generations go by, are becoming progressively isolated from religion and the sense of the sacred. And on the other hand, it is also fundamentalist. So this book is remarkable because each of the essays is interesting in its own right and well worth your time to read and to examine. But as I mentioned, the whole flows together very beautifully. And that's because, of course, the book is the product of not only however many decades of study, rigorous study at the best universities in the Muslim world and in the West, but also of praxis, of deliberative, mindful, careful, constant, and consistent practice. And this, of course, is reflecting the prophetic hadith that the most beloved things to the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him and his family, are those good deeds, those hasanat, done with consistency. And what one sees at the core of this movement, regardless again if one ideologically falls into Sunnism or not, the core leading figures in the United States, of course, would be Dr. Omar Farooq Abdallah and Dr. Hamza Yusuf, of course, Shaykh Hamza being the president of Zaytuna College. So with these two forces in Britain and America, Cambridge Muslim College and Zaytuna College, we see the launching of a classical, neo-traditional Islamic model for authentic, principled engagement with the best of the liberal, truly liberal education. And by that I don't mean liberal in the modern political sense, but liberal in the sense of a grounding in the totality of the humanities, and also in the trivium and the quadrivium. So a classical Western approach to education merged with a classical Islamic education. So I can speak as one who has benefited immensely on a personal basis, spiritually and intellectually and academically, from the publications, the research journals, and the faculty of Cambridge Muslim College and Zaytuna College, that both these institutions are invaluable, not just for Muslims, but for non-Muslims interested academically in Islam. So with that, I'll get right into it. Chapter 6 is entitled Good Anger, Bad Anger, and Shirk al-Asbab. Begins with a quote from the Quran. Woe to those whose hearts are hard against God's remembrance. Quran, Surah 39, verse 23. The process of entropic degeneration, which seems to be foretold by all world religions, is marked both by realities that anger us and by the ready abuse of anger as an emotion. When Babylon the Great appears, mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, how shall the righteous fail to be wrathful against her. Surely the end times, and the times which resemble and seem to foreshadow them, will necessarily be times of outrage. True religion must always, even at that extreme point of history, allow anger at the defiance of heaven and the rule of hubris, which will both intensify as the age wears on. Yet it must also be vigilant against the anger that is born of the despair and sense of siege which are so common under extreme social and political conditions, and which comprise a poorly disguised anger against God and his arrangement of history. Success in times of abandonment comes from endurance and self-discipline, driven by the certain knowledge that, verily, with hardship comes ease, as the Quran says in Surah 94, verse 6, and that after the day of anger itself, all wrongs will be entirely righted and their victims healed. To achieve this awareness, the alienation from the times must not be divorced from the alienation from worldliness. On the contrary, the latter must be its urgently needed support, lest we become merely another sign of the times. There will never be an age in which the bulk of Muslim anger should be directed against others, rather than against our own inner demons. The faults of others are conjectural in various ways. Our own faults are certain. This, of course, is a central, if not the recurring central theme in the quietist Sufi perspective, and that is to say, in contradistinction to certain forms of fundamentalisms, whether Sunni or Shia, or revolutionary attitudes, the Sunni Sufi perspective has always been chiefly, primarily concerned on an intellectual level with the first looking within the self, before you would look outside at all of the problems in the world, whether locally, on your street, or in your neighborhood, or in your town, or globally, those nations over there. Of course, the whole world now, the whole Muslim world, is constantly thinking of the Palestinians. And this in no ways detracts from that. That is not what I mean by quietism. I don't mean to say a deliberate cowardly inaction in the face of transparent evil and inhumanity, but rather what I believe the Shaykh is saying here is that it does no good when confronted with the inevitable evils of the world in every age, especially our own, with the internet making all of them so seemingly instantly accessible to us. Day after day after day, we read of new horrors, whether in Palestine or in certain governments across the world, in certain areas across the world. But it does no good for the individual soul contemplating these things, these horrors, when none of us are in a position on an individual basis to actually stop them or to do anything other than, of course, as the Hadith says, to hate them in our heart, which is the lowest level of faith, and then the next level, if we can, to speak out against it. And if we can then go beyond that, then yes, to actually fight it bodily. But is that possible for everyone? No. So what must one first do if one is going to adhere to and endure in this ever-changing world full of so many seeming injustices that do not end, that do not have their correction in this world? One must look within, and one must purify the self as much as one can, and one must rectify one's self. This, of course, is not very popular. It's much easier, it's much more appetizing to constantly want to critique the faults of others, is it not? Certainly, speaking for myself, of course, every human being has this tendency, but is it productive? There are always, at the end of the day, in any religion, in any saintly path, and of course this is primarily concerned with the Islamic path, but all religions do teach that one should first critique one's self, because at the end of the day, you are firstly and foremost responsible for yourself. The condition that you bring your soul in back to God when your body is separated from the soul This is what ultimately will matter the most to you in the measuring out of things. So under modern conditions, when Ishmaelites, a term that he often uses here for Muslims, the spiritual children of Ishmael, are confronted both by the cruelty of Eastern regimes, meaning the despotic political regimes in much of the Muslim world, and by Western calamity-making in Palestine, Iraq, and Libya, the discernment between decent and demonic anger is a particularly pressing task for Muslim self-preservation and inner equanimity. But it is not simple. The traditional believer may rightly be wrathful, but this will be for God, never for himself, since the self is a misunderstanding wrapped in a misunderstanding, and selflessness is an aspect of sunnah emulation. Prophetically conformed individuals must respond passionately to the misery caused by human error, and therefore, a fortiori, to the error itself. But they must also remain serenely confident in God's omnipotence. A discernment between right and wrongful wrath, between a cold and a panicked anger, is hence a consequence and corollary of faith, a spiritual discipline of irreplaceable importance in our age of turbulence. The man of praise, Ahmed, Muhammad, the praised one, offers a timeless model of this balance. As witness and sharer in the suffering of his people and in the agony of the weak and orphaned against the complacency of the Qurayshite oligarchs, the oligarchs of his tribe, he could be rightly angry. Here he was hardly an innovator among the messengers. Moses is furious when the Israelites turn to the golden calf, Quran 20, verse 86. The Gospels, Jesus is angry with the Pharisees as he forbids the remarriage of divorcees in Mark 10, 5 through 12, and he calls them a brood of vipers, Matthew 12:34, and hypocrites, Matthew 15:7. His anger, Christ's anger, causes him to act in true zealot fashion, driving the money changers out of the temple with a whip in John 2:15-17. The seal of the prophets, Khatam al-Anbiya, a title for the Prophet Muhammad, crying out against the cruelty of the elites and layhabists of his day, stands faithfully in the same tradition of exemplars who are fully human and are therefore emotional. I am only a human being, he says. I am pleased as humans are, and grow angry as they do. Anger is certainly and necessarily a dimension of prophethood, righteous anger. His conforming to God, however, also ensured that hilm, mild forbearance, was his governing trait. Classical treatments of anger cite instances of his righteous wrath, but overwhelmingly focus on his mercy and patience, which are unmistakably and repeatedly more central to the Sunnah, his way, his living tradition. This explains why, although anger can be a sign of conformity to God, the overwhelming bulk of hadith on the subject strongly denounce it. When asked how to avert God's anger, he replied, "Abandon your own anger." And again, these are other hadiths here. Anger is a red-hot coal in the heart of Adam's children. Have you not beheld his bloodshot eyes and his swollen jowls? Whoever senses any part of that should lie down on the ground. So literally calm yourself down, go lie on the cool ground, right? In a desert environment there, at night, of course, the ground is quite cold. Anger is from Satan, and Satan was created of fire. Since fire is only put out by water, let each of you carry out wudu if he is angry, meaning go make the ritual, the minor ritual ablution. Wash your mouth, your nose, your face, wash your arms, wash your head, wash your feet. And if in that process of doing it you haven't calmed down, well, do it again, or sit quietly. Despite the large number of such hadiths, the prophetic counsel is not to become a stoic, an emotionally frigid, impassible Vulcan, but rather to use the emotions as God wishes, and not in vengeful obedience to the self or to the passions. Imam al-Nawawi, commenting on the prophetic commandment, "Be not angry," la taghdab, explains that the meaning is, do not act in accordance with your anger. The prohibition does not refer to anger itself, for that is part of human nature. In other words, it's all well and good to be justifiably angry about something, an injustice especially. But should you act precipitously, should you act without careful thought beforehand, you may make the situation worse, you may even indeed cause disaster to befall you, those you love, or a community that you love. In the midst of one's valid anger, one acts within the boundaries of the law, the sacred law, the Sharia of Islam, and maintains good akhlaq, good etiquette, good manners, good comportment. Anger may remind us of the need to act, but it is never the motivation or justification of any righteous act. It must not rival the revealed will. God must judge, not the human nervous system. Here we may locate one reason why the Quran praises those who, when angered, are forgiving, Surah 42, verse 37, and those who suppress their rage and forgive people, and God loves the workers of good, Surah 2, verse 134. Abdal Murad continues, the last expression is muhsinin, the people who do the beautiful, ihsan, who are, in the famous hadith of supererogatory devotions, the hadith al-nawafil, in a love relationship with their Lord, God, who says, this is a hadith Qudsi of God speaking here through the mouth of the Prophet, so this is the voice of God, and when I love him, I become the eye with which he hears, the ear with which he hears. It's a small typo, it should say the eye with which he sees, but the eye with which he sees, the ear with which he hears, the hand with which he strikes, and the foot on which he walks. If he seeks my protection, I shall surely grant it to him, and if he seeks victory from me, I shall surely grant it to him. This is the degree of the individual the hadith calls the wali, the friend of God. He is the true Khalifa, his representative, and it is he who has been taught all the names, as Adam was, Surah 2, verse 31. This Adamic archetype is not the one who ignores the relevance of the divine wrath, but is the one who properly discerns true from false anger. As Khalifa, Caliph, or vicegerent or deputy, he manifests qualities whose ontic root lies in the divine perfection, and anger is compatible with these. Prophetic scriptures, from time to time, use the language of divine anger, and those who are close to God, by definition, share this. As Nifari's God tells the saint, if I appoint thee my Khalifa, I will make thy wrath to be from my wrath. By contrast, the anger of the self, the nafs, is the mark of the non-caliphal rebel soul. The next chapter, chapter 7, I'm skipping ahead quite a bit, push back with something more beautiful. Quran, Surah 41, verse 34, minority Muslims, from complainants to therapists, is, I believe, a wonderful sequel to this, not just lineally in the book, but especially for the current global situation confronting Muslims throughout the world collectively. And of course here I'm speaking predominantly of Palestine, but also of the entire, in many ways, miserable political condition of so much of the Muslim world, of so much suffering, and yet in that, in the injustices, in the brutalities, and yet there is still in all of these societies tremendous beauty, tremendous goodness, tremendous truth, and tremendous strength in the ongoing and enduring aspects of traditional Muslim life that remain relatively, if not unperturbed by the externalities and the horrors around them, at least somehow, by the grace of God, enduring and surviving, persisting. The quote From The Merchant of Venice of Shakespeare, Act 3, Scene 1. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. In our Islamophobic age, a popular Muslim response to secular discursive violence, meaning anti-Islamic prejudice among militant secular people, so militant atheists in the West, has been a tit-for-tat reciprocation, thar in the Arabic terminology. Not a few ghetto sermonizers retaliate against the nationalist populists by deploying an angry and bullying agitprop of their own. This in turn quickly displays the familiar drawback of a lex talionis, in other words, the law of equivalent retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on, which of course makes the whole world blind, or toothless. It tends to ignite a cycle of feuding until, as Nizam ad-Din Awliya observed, the great Sultan Saint of Delhi, if a man casts a thorn in your path, and you cast another thorn in his, the world will be full of thorns. Fearful preachers and bloggers, parrying the vitriol of what they experience as a feminist, pansexualist, philo-Zionist establishment media, and goaded by furious anti-Ishmael, anti-Muslim politicians of the Wilders or Jensen type, often reply in kind, in other words, savaging what they see as the failures of the West. When militant Western bigots are attacking Islam, they respond with usually attacks on the so-called degenerate nature of the modern West. He's saying this is not helpful. What good does this do? They often reply in kind, amplifying the faults of Europe and generalizing about its violent urges just as effectively as the chauvinists of the host societies are seeking to do in their typecasting of the Muslim soul. In other words, mutual failure, mutual non-engagement, mutual distrust, and societal breakdown. A vicious circle is the certain outcome of this. As so often, chauvinisms become mutually parasitic. But the odds are stacked against the minorities, in other words, here against the Muslims. In the longer term, if matters progress, it is likely that the weaker and smaller side of this zero-sum game will be destroyed. Of course, Islam is certainly not passive or pacifist, any more than is mainline Christianity. Even Buddhism allows a bodhisattva to resist someone who is in the act of committing murder. Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, for the sake of brevity, doesn't go into this here, but as one also knows in Buddhist theology, a righteous Buddhist king, a Chakravartin, a wheel cycle ruler, a virtuous universal king, or world king, world emperor, himself must, of course, defend the physical borders of his kingdom and the Buddhist faithful and practitioners of his kingdom. So he, of course, would take upon himself the defense of that through, when necessary, physical violence. In other words, resisting an armed invasion by an enemy through force, having an army, and so on. And what he would do then is take on, in the Buddhist belief, the negative karma of all of those kills onto his own soul, with the understanding that, of course, what he was doing ultimately for the greater good. Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad continues, religion campaigns for justice, and sometimes a lex talionis, a qisas, to use the Arabic term, is needed to instantiate fairness and equilibrium, and to protect the weak. There is an established retributive theory in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, no less than in the standard Western accounts, that hold that there must be chastisement, and that it must fit the crime. The punishment must fit the crime. Justice is always, in a certain sense, society's retaliation, its controlled, proportionate use of lawful repression. After learning of David's victory over Goliath, we are told that had God not pushed back, daf in Arabic, some men by means of others, the earth would have been corrupted. Quran, Surah 2, verse 251. In the era of the man of praise, Muhammad, the verse authorizing the Muslims to fight back against the Philistines of the Quraysh includes a noticeably similar sequence. Quote, and had God not pushed back, Daf, some men by means of others, cloisters and churches and oratories and mosques wherein the name of God is oft mentioned, would assuredly have been torn down. Surah 22, verse 40. In other words, here, of course, this is a verse in which the Muslims are presented as the protectors of Christian holy sites, which, of course, is something that historically they, by and large, not always, but by and large, did. The oldest surviving continuously inhabited monastery in the Eastern Christian world, and the Western Christian world for that matter, is St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in the desert of Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula. And this monastery was established shortly before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad during the reign of the great Emperor Justinian. I say great because of his undeniable importance as a codifier of Roman law and a brief, ultimately failed restitutor, a restorer of much of the territories of the Roman Empire that had for many centuries been lost to the Greek-speaking East, the Byzantines, as they were later known. I don't want to digress too much, but of course Justinian was also a great persecuting emperor who harnessed the full power of the imperial state and his new law codes to punish those he deemed Christian heretics, as well as the surviving polytheists of the Neoplatonic schools and Jews with religious persecution. He closed down and destroyed many synagogues. He closed down the last surviving polytheistic schools of Neoplatonic philosophy in Athens and Alexandria, and he instituted death by fire, burning, as the punishment for those deemed Christian heretics. He was, of course, a great patron of church building and architecture. He had the third Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built on the present site of the current structure, which the foundation of which is his work, and he built numerous other churches as well, and aqueducts and so on, and public baths, and he built many monasteries. And so this monastery, St. Catherine's, was endowed at the far southeastern corner of his empire in dedication to the great Alexandrian martyr princess Catherine. And only about 70 or 75 years into its history, it came under Muslim control, Muslim rulership, and by and large has been peacefully under it ever since. So I do think that that is something worth pointing out, that there is a Quranic basis, much more elaborated upon in the prophetic hadith, that Muslims are to engage whenever they encounter monks and nuns of the Christian communities in tremendously respectful dialogue, not to molest them, not to harm them, and when needed to protect them. Muslims have not always followed that in the political history, but by and large these are principles that remain enduringly powerful today, as one sees in the places such as Gaza. As the commentary Razi notes, here Abdul Hakim Murad is referring to Fakhr ad-Din Razi, the great Persian polymath. God pushes back, by means of some men, others who are intent on riot and stirring up seditions in the world. And those who push back are the prophets, upon them be peace, and after them the leaders and kings who uphold his laws. And this is why there must be rulers, for otherwise murder and criminality would prevail in the world. Razi also confirms that this act is discursive as well as legal. Literally, daf does mean pushing or pushing back, and the reference is therefore to the prophetic teaching of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi an al Munkar, commanding the good or enjoining the good and forbidding the evil, which in the first instance must be verbal. Indeed, unless one wields due political sovereignty, it can be nothing else. In other words, you don't have the right to, through vigilante, so-called justice, prevent the doing of evil things by your neighbors or fellow citizens. This is the prerogative exclusively of a justly constituted political state or political order. A Muslim theology of just response to European rhetorical assault and the progressive confiscation of civil rights would be well advised to be intelligent in its pushing back, and to avoid the jahili, the ignorant, impulses of panic and outraged pride. Moral excellence, rather than enjoying a succulent dish of revenge served hot or cold, is always the authentic Muslim goal. A lex talionis, or qisas, provides, as the Quran observes in 2:179, hayat, or life. The social order is protected when authority punishes destructive behavior by proportionately pushing back against it. Thus were the endless feudings of pagan Arabia brought to an end by Islam. The preachers intuit this well enough. Justice is God's requirement, and it is not only their emotions which clamor for it. Yet the Quran, as ever, insists not just on a certain instrumental practicality based on God's observed customs on earth, but on a higher, stranger, and more radical ideal, which announces that what the Ottomans called the order of the world, Nizam al-Alam in Persian, is not finally maintained by imposing a dry calculus of benefit and loss, but by sacrificing the ego. This is intrinsic to a real theosociology, in other words, a God-centered approach to human societies and understanding them. Let us then explore the possibility of nuancing the discourse of the lex talionis, suggesting that justice may be transcended without the consequence being itself unjust. Here we part company not only with the Jahiliyyah, the ignorant ones, but with a Mu'tazilite ethic, which assumes that forgiveness cannot override the strict application of God's justice. Sunnism takes itself to be a form of Islam which champions justice while insisting that it can be consummated, not vitiated, by forgiveness and remission. The conquest of Mecca, or the Fath al-Mecca, the opening of Mecca by the Prophet, represents this as the indicative climax of the seerah, of the prophetic biography. It is represented again by the determination to draw a line under the disputes which arose among the early believers. In the Irenaic, peaceful in other words, and medicinal phrase, the companions were all upright. As-sahaba kulluhum udul. This, of course, again, is something that the vast majority of Muslims who are Sunni uphold. Shia Muslims do not. This is a major distinction between the two branches of the Muslim world. Eschatologically, too, the entire controversy over the prophetic intercession is revealing. Beyond strict justice, the man of praise, the Prophet Muhammad, intercedes. My intercession is for the perpetrators of grave sins in my community, which in Arabic is Shafa'ati li al-kabair min ummati. For Mu'tazilites, God's justice must be done. He must send the sinner to hell. For Sunnis, by contrast, God's justice, like human justice, is of a moral nature which admits the possibility that it is not compromised by being transcended in favor of mercy, but is actually reinforced and made characteristically and even mysteriously divine. This is, of course, part of the moral appeal of theism itself. Buddhism can hardly admit of a metaphysical type of forgiveness. Secular jurisprudence, always instrumental, technical, and pragmatic, may acknowledge remission and even a type of mercy, as we see with amnesties, pleas for clemency, or the decisions of parole boards, but this tends to be rooted in ultimately profane considerations of civic utility and has very limited scope. It struggles even to be Kantian. In other words, it has less of a moral basis than even Immanuel Kant's understanding of morality and ethics, which of course is imperfect from a theistic perspective, but Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad is arguing is actually usually more developed if one reads the genealogy of the metaphysics of morals and so on, as I did as an undergrad. One finds that Kantian metaphysics from an atheistic or agnostic modern secular perspective is quite advanced. So we are faced with this challenge to speak a Muslim language to an insulting and stigmatizing verbal culture, to defend what we experience as the most pure and precious set of virtues and forms of life, but which remains loyal to this anti-Mu'tazilite style of the affirmation of justice through its transcendence, thus stepping outside the vicious circle where secular logic seems to promise a world of thorns. There must be a philosophy of higher reciprocation at the heart of what we have called meta-citizenship, but where is it to be found? To the perplexity of Islam's cultured despisers, such as the theologian who informed readers of the Times of London that Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, quote, neatly marks out his teaching, both from Islam and from the cold logic of secularism. He's quoting here with criticism the letter by Tom Wright from the 19th of February 2019. The Quran, far from presenting a Mutazilite legalism or advocating a God of the type described by Khalid Blankenship as a cosmic justice machine, rather deeply internalizes its own theology of the transcendence of strict justice. Indeed, the lex talionis has its due place, and indeed that does, in matters of social boundaries, supply hayat, life, for the made weak, the mustad'afin in particular. Life is provided for the vulnerable and oppressed, the homeless, the lone mother, the child, the orphan, the pauper, by the egoless wielding of power, where directed by the qadi, the Islamic judge. Constraint preserves life. That is its proper legitimation. To that extent, we are sociological. But this is only one dimension of the full Quranic story. Indeed, those Muslim preachers of a tanfiri bent who focus only on a bitter discourse of requital, punishment for sin, and so on, have not adopted even a superficial Quranic reading, but have averted their eyes from some key passages which are universally accepted by the exegetes from the time of the first generation, in other words, of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in, the first generation of the Prophet's companions, those who knew him personally, and then the next generation, so early Islamic history, as defining and axiomatic. The Sunni principle of a kind of meta-justice, a justice which transgresses the limits of a simple utilitarian logic, is drawn from key scriptural texts. The Quran speaks not of virtues, fada'il, but of an equation between beauty and truth, and hence with conformity to perfections ontologically sourced in the divine nature. The Quranic language thus elides concepts of beauty and goodness in one lexical range, that of the root husn, HSN. Later Sufi theorists took this convergence as the root of a complex aestheticizing view of human excellence. However, it is not necessary here to propose an esoteric reading of Scripture or some very creative exegesis of a putatively mediocre exoterism. Such maneuvers are routinely and often abusively attempted by assorted reformist or liberalizing tendencies, which internalize a letter-spirit dichotomy, which is, as Massignon and so many others have seen, simply alien to the tradition which accepts the fiqh, the jurisprudence of the exoteric, of the Sharia, as part of the essence of Islam. The texts we will use to explore this Ishmaelite meta-justice will be drawn primarily from the exoteric discourse of ulama, of Islamic scholars, who wrote, but seldom, at least publicly, on esoteric topics. And just moving ahead to one last part that I wanted to share with you. Continuing on page 172, Abdal Murad notes, classical Islam's discourse of husn, of moral beauty, went much further. While Mutazilites demurred, Asharite and Maturidi exegetes, in other words, what came to be mainstream Sunni exegetes, were not slow to spot Revelation's insistence on a virtue of higher reciprocation which allowed individuals the right to respond not in kind or simply proportionately, but through, in the Quran's startling phrase, repelling or pushing back with what is more beautiful. Idfa billati hayya asan. This phrase stands at the heart of a surah which is particularly insistent on ethics as ihsan, in William Chittick's translation, Doing the Beautiful. The surah is number 41, entitled Fusilat. Moving ahead very briefly, there's an interesting anecdote related by Tabari, the great early Muslim historiographer, noted for his encyclopedic knowledge of the Athar, the sayings of the Salaf, the first generations of Muslims. And sure enough, Hakim Murad writes, we are now given a sequence of these. One representative example is an uneasy tale of the first caliph, Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was once in the mosque where someone was insulting him, while the Blessed Prophet was watching the situation unfold. Abu Bakr excused him for a while, meaning he kind of just ignored or put up with the man who was insulting him to his face. Then anger overcame Abu Bakr, and he uttered a riposte. He responded in anger. At this, the Holy Prophet stood and left, to be followed perplexedly by Abu Bakr, who asked him, the man kept insulting me, and I was forgiving and overlooked the actions, while you simply remained seated. But when I started to defend myself, you rose and left. And the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, replied, an angel was replying to him on your behalf. إِنَّهُ كَانَ يَرْدُ عَنْكَ مَلْكٌ مِنْ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. But when you started to react and defend yourself, the angel left, and the devil came. By God, Abu Bakr, I will never remain in the devil's presence. This narrative, which ends with a hint of the next verse, should a prompting from Satan stir you, seek refuge with God. In other words, this is from his long commentary on the Quran itself, his tafsir. This narrative lies at the core of Tabari's understanding of this passage. For him, it comprises a masterpiece of religious psychology. On page 183, Hakim Murad writes, of course, Muslim forbearance in the face of chauvinism and misrepresentation is already abundantly present in the West. Most take the abuse on the chin silently and keep their hope in God. The Economist heads a report on a survey by describing British Muslims as pious and loyal. It is only the radical Tanfiri fringes who take the law into their own hands, or who use hate speech to counter the hate speech of liberal or populist polemicists, and this is because of their inner frailty and a capitulation to an outraged pride. Generally, in Europe and around the world, one finds that traditional mosque-going Muslims marvelously retain the virtue of hilm, mildness, which a certain Islamophobic discourse claims to be alien to them. Those who travel in Muslim lands or know Muslim communities in the West frequently remark on this. Yes, one only has to see this oneself when one visits in parts of the Muslim-majority world. One sees the general calm and serenity of the people, most especially in the mosques, of course, during, before, and after the prayers. But as they go about on the streets, there is a general calm, even if it's in one of the teeming cities like Istanbul or Cairo with 15 or 20 million people. The task, then, is for the ulama, the truly uncompromising usuli scholars of the religion, to challenge those who react destructively and self-destructively to monoculturalist verbal or legal violence. In other words, violence by European or European or American, Western fundamentalist modernists on one hand, progressive modernists, or fundamentalist, say Christians, both of whom would have nationalist, anti-Muslim, prejudicial views. Disciplining the lower self should be preserved as a foundational Muslim act, the basic formation of the believing conscience, which may then safely recognize religious options. Zealots should be helped to understand that their abusive language, which one can hear, to cite only one platform, on a sad abundance of Muslim websites, quickly closes Western minds and hearts and makes the spread of the message of Tawheed far more difficult. Sulaiman ibn Tarkhan, disciple of Ibn Masud, used to say, "No one will accept your view if you have made him angry." How true this is. Thorough and successful inner victory alone will qualify us to condemn others. Good luck, right? On the matter of Amr bil Maruf wa Nahi al Munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding the evil, Imam al-Ghazali warns us as follows, and this of course is from his Ihya Ulumuddin, book 4, verse 615. Herein lies a very great danger which must be avoided, as it leads straight to destruction. This appears when a scholar, when drawing attention to someone's fault, beholds the glory of his own erudition and the lowliness of the ignorant person. His criticism may even have the intention of humiliating someone and proving his own superiority. If this is his motivation, then this evil is worse than the evil he is condemning. I thought that was very interesting. And of course, it's of perennial relevance, whether one is a scholar or a student of religion or in any field of life, that if one is going to be criticizing someone, one should try to do it as gently as possible. Of course, in Islamic etiquette, there's an entire adab and a set of rules and principles as to how one should correct someone. For instance, if one has to admonish someone, it should be in private. It should not embarrass them by doing it in a public place. That's one of the most basic aspects. Anyway, this book is a treasure trove. The essays by themselves are interesting. If you have very limited time, want to read one every week or something like that, it's very doable. And again, traveling home, essays on Islam in Europe, but absolutely relevant as well for Islam in America, especially in the current year, in the current administration, and so on. Best wishes to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. As always, please do subscribe if you'd like to follow and get notified as to our next videos. Thanks so much.